Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who have found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We'll unpack the experience, where they felt stuck, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others and finding possibility for yourself. Let's get into this week's conversation. And we are back for another exciting episode of Off the Comma, another exciting story that we get to hear and observe and witness and learn from. And very excited about this week. Another kind of new member to the Off the Comma community. I'm looking forward to learning about this person through his story today and learning about him. Peter Moore is our guest. I'm going to let him introduce himself here in just a moment. And he and I haven't met or talked before outside of coordinating and scheduling this podcast. So I'm really excited to hear what Peter has to share today. So I tell you what, why don't I just stop rambling? Peter, why don't you introduce yourself? Why don't you start with your name? Obviously, I've already shared that. And how would you like to be known? Start with that, and then anything else you would like folks to know about you.
Sure. Well, the name is Peter Moore, as we've established. I'm a writer and cartoonist living in Colorado. And the amazing thing about this is I came out of a long career in magazines, which we'll get into later. But that whole world vanished on me a few years ago, and I had to redefine who I am. So calling myself a writer and cartoonist now is it's maybe not surprising to all of you out there, but it's very surprising for me to even be able to say it. But it's true, which is great.
Nice. Writer and cartoonist. So already you've got my attention. I'm excited to kind of hear more about that and how it shows up in your story. Peter, as you think about yourself as a human being, like what kinds of, let's say three adjectives, that's kind of what we normally do here. What are three words that might describe you as a person, as a human being?
Uh, I'm, I'm an adventurer. I like to think I have a good sense of humor, and I'm generally enthusiastic about everything. So how about that?
Yeah, I like it. I like it. I'm looking forward to seeing how those traits show up in the telling of your story today. Anything else that you haven't already shared that you would like people to know about you, just by way of introduction, and not to get into the story too far, but hobbies, interests, anything else about your work? Just
I
anything?
mean, there's a reason why I live in Colorado now. They people in Colorado talk about they have the world's best backyard, and I love frolicking in the backyard of Colorado. So I'm a
Mm.
skier, I'm a hiker, I'm a watercolorist out in nature, um, backpacker, like all those things, all those outdoor things that you think of Coloradans as doing. I do those things, and I love them.
Nice. Nice. It is beautiful there. That's I'm a Californian, but I don't know, Colorado flirts with me sometimes, so I get it. Okay, let's not put the emphasis on me. Let's continue. So Peter, obviously here in a couple of minutes we're going to get into your story with the five questions that we use. But one of the things I do with every guest before we get into your story is as you think ahead to the next 35, 40 minutes or so and sharing your story with us, what intention would you have for yourself today?
Well, I think telling my story, I hope I'm telling other people's stories or maybe turns that they would like to have in their own story. So I know in the first question, I'm going to be on the comma. And I just want to reassure people that just because one thing in your life stops or changes doesn't mean that it's the end. And what I'm hoping is that in the next 40 minutes, I'll be able to convince people that, it's not original with me that endings are new beginnings, but it really happened
Mm,
with me. And it can happen with people who are listening here, hoping for their own new beginning after an ending. So
mm.
my intention would be to share the anxiety of that, but also the joy in it too. And I'm so happy to be on the joy side and much less on the anxiety side now.
I love that. I love as you talk about the endings and beginnings, it reminds me of that song from a decade or so ago, 2 decades, time flies, closing time, where like every new beginning starts with some other beginning's end, and it's so powerful. My intention today for us is to support your intention and to do that by creating a space for you to be able to tell your story here And that there will be other people out there, just like you mentioned, who will see a little bit of themselves in you and your story. They'll feel a little bit more connected to someone who kind of sees and gets them a little less alone. And in the best of cases, maybe feel inspired or empowered to go out and do something that they've secretly been wanting to do. So let's
Of
jump
course.
into the first question then, as you alluded to. So question one, Peter, is where in your life have you found yourself sitting on a comma?
I love even the name of this podcast because as a writer and editor, I dealt with, I wrote a lot of commas in my life and
Mm,
published them. So I really get commas. It's been part of my career. And, it's funny how looking back on where I was 10, 15 years ago, the magazine and book industries in the US were a very big deal there. And I had a super responsible job right in the epicenter of it. I was the editor of Men's Health magazine. I was
mm,
ghostwriting books, and I I'd been on a run at Men's Health for 20 years. I worked at the magazine, fulfilling various editorial roles, and ended up as vice president and editor of Men's Health, which was, it was a magazine with 20 million readers around the world. So it was kind of a big deal to be there. Um, but I also, as a leader of that magazine and as somebody who participated on the editorial and on the business side, I knew that the business was changing, that the internet had really intruded on what I did. And, frankly, I was anxious about it, about where all this would lead me. So in 2015, I negotiated with my boss that I would take 3 months of sabbatical, and interspersed throughout the year. And my wife and I were literally traveling around the world, trying out new places to live. What would be the next phase of our life? Naturally, the ending to that story is that when I returned to the office in December, I had an email that said that it was inviting me to this conference room I'd never been in a building where
mm,
I'd worked for 8 years. I thought, well, that's a little odd, isn't it? Of course, when I walked in there, it was the full array of HR plus my boss at the time, who was laying me off.
mm,
So after 20 years at Men's Health magazine, I was on the comma. I walked out that door. I had a job when I walked in. I didn't have a job when I walked out.
mm,
Fortunately, I'd been with the magazine forever, as I said, so that I had generous severance package that went with it. Plus, I had signed a contract to ghostwrite a book for a fitness guru. So, I knew not like I was ever going to starve, but everything that I had known my entire life, all of my colleagues, these people were very important to me, many of them close friends. This process that I had been part of for 20 years was all on December 15th, 2015, cut off. It was over.
mm,
And
mm,
I was on the comma like never before. There was a certain momentum that I had in my career, meaning I signed that book contract. So I knew what was going to be happening next. But then so it's like it was kind of a partial comma there. Then COVID hit. 2020
mm,
came, and that is when everything just fell apart for me. I had a number of freelance gigs. I was editing a cannabis magazine, if you can believe that. That died during COVID. Most of my freelance work went away during COVID because the magazines I had been writing for were also falling apart or were changing formats, so that they couldn't pay me what they used to. And it was a very dark moment for me. It was a very quiet moment. It was a moment when uh, all this long list of colleagues that I had. And, for me, the office was really a social place as well as a place where I earned my living. Those
mm,
colleagues went away too. And, it was dark and quiet. And I had to ask myself, what's next for me? And, as we'll get into, I now savor the thought of that quiet and what it did for me. But I was big time on the comma there. And I'm very grateful to be able to look back at it now and say, oh, I can see what the rest of the sentence is going to say after that comma.
mm. Well, let's and obviously that's why you're here, right? Because you've kind of moved on in the story. But let's take a moment to kind of go in a little bit deeper because this usually shows up in the conversation. A lot of us can listen, especially when it comes to layoffs. I'm one of many people who, yep, I remember that. I know what that's like, right? So there's the many of us can say, yeah, 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 uh-huh, I can relate to that. I can make some assumptions about it. And then there's the no, what was it truly like for you? And you use the words dark and quiet, but what what was it like for you during this time? Like what was going through your mind? What kinds of things were really kind of occupying you as you were sitting on this comma and trying to think and look forward or backwards or where you were?
Well, I was a guy, I had a series of high profile jobs in the publishing industry. I mean, I personally was the articles editor of Playboy, if you can believe
Mm,
that. I mean,
mm,
it's like, it's a punchline job title that I personally filled. Um,
mm,
but you can hear in that, I'm talking about I was the editor of Men's Health magazine, I was the articles editor of Playboy, but you can hear that in those terms, I'm defining myself by what I did, my affiliation with Men's Health, my affiliation with Playboy, other magazines that I worked for. Suddenly I had no affiliation. It
mm,
was just me. It was just my lonely little name, Peter Moore, out there floating in the universe. I had, for instance, when I was working at Men's Health, I sent an email off to the White House when Barack Obama was, sitting in the Oval Office, and I said, I would like to come to Washington, interview Barack, and for a cover story in Men's Health. And I sent an email, went off for a run. And when I came back from the run, there was a response from the White House saying, "Yes, we want to do this."
wow.
So, so there were perks to being affiliated with a big magazine like Men's Health.
Hmm.
The question became, what am I without that affiliation? Clearly, the White House didn't say yes to that because they thought I was a great guy. They said yes to that because I represented a vast readership around the world and the president's access to that readership. So, that worked out great when I was working for Men's Health. When I was no longer there, when I was, on the comma, when I was trying to define who I was, it was a very lonely experience. And you know what? At that point, I didn't even know if I was anyone. It was like
Mm,
I was always defined through my access. And also, I mentioned that I had a ghostwriting deal when I was thrown out the door at Men's Health.
hmm.
What that meant was that I was sublimating who I am to this guy who I was writing a book for. Turns out he was a terrific guy. I don't regret, the year and a half I spent working with him on his book. It was lucrative to do that, but the result was that I had done a very good job writing a really good book for somebody who wasn't me, not in my voice, had no credit for me except for that I was able to translate him onto the page well. But I had to ask myself, what's the deal with spending 3 decades using your voice to tell other people's stories? And that's essentially what I did in the magazines I worked for.
Mm,
It's certainly what I did in my ghostwriting career. And it made me feel a little schizophrenic. It's like, sure, I can take on all these voices and be other people for a living, and it was a very good living. But who am I in the midst of all that? Am I
mm,
just a scribe? Am I, in fact, other people's voices? Do I even have a voice? Do I deserve to speak with my own voice? Like, do I have permission? Do I give myself permission to be myself in the public facing realm that is publishing? I had a lot of questions I had to answer and figure out, and look within to ask myself, okay, what drives me now? What's my passion? What do I have to offer? And that's a stark question to ask, because the answer is you're nobody, you have nothing to say, so just give up. That could be one
mm.
possible discovery. Happy to say
Yeah.
now that isn't what happened, but at the time I didn't know that, and that was scary.
Yeah. Well, I just want to acknowledge you for that. And like, if I can just kind of ramble for a moment here, you know, that had to have been challenging, as you've described, just from the sheer like the identity of it all, this wasn't just affiliation with things, it was big name, big status, big access things, right? So that kind of identity and affiliation is significant, and then to have to kind of redefine yourself away from that is significant. And it seems like this is similar to what I hear so many other people talk about, and I experience myself, right? Is people experience this, whether it's affiliation with a family that they've had a falling out of, or whether it's affiliation with a particular place that maybe they've moved away from. I mean, there's so many ways that the same kind of dynamic can show up for us. And I'm hearing you describe it in terms of who am I? So, kind of the beingness that's associated with that affiliation, and also a little bit, but it seems like not so much of the what do I do next as much as the who am I without those affiliations. That seems like kind of the unique flavor of your experience that you're describing here.
Well, the what do I do next absolutely hit me when COVID struck.
Hmm.
I lost another job then. I lost all my freelance projects. I decided that ghostwriting, even though I was good at it and had made a lot of money at it, it didn't appeal anymore. So,
Hmm.
I put red lines through so many of the things that I had been doing up to that point that, I had a to-do list with nothing on it. And the question was going to be, how do I fill my life now? What is my fulfilling work given the circumstances that I'm in now? And,
Hmm.
you know, I wasn't sure. I didn't know where I was going to go. I'm not the kind of guy who would say, I had a good career, I'll retire now. I just wrote a piece last year for the Saturday Evening Post, which the headline I put on it was, I'll retire when I'm dead.
Mm.
That isn't how it ran at that in the magazine. Um, but that's how I look at my work because I want my work to be essential to me. And the only way I would give up that work is by not being physically there to do it any longer. But the question is,
Hmm.
what kind of life fulfilling work is there for me? What can fill up my days in the way that my magazine and publishing work did, but that is more essential to me and is more authentic and more fulfilling? And I had to figure that out. And it's not an obvious answer ever.
Yeah. Well, this is a good segue, I think, into question two. So the second question, feel free to continue to tell the story, go backwards if you need to expand, but you're kind of taking us there, right? The second question is, as you look back at this comma that you were sitting on, what did it create for you?
So I had a couple of friends who were in the same boat that I was, having gone through major career transitions. So many of them were brought on by COVID, and so I was doing every Monday we would gather to, just talk ourselves through that very quiet time that COVID was for many of us, a very lonely time.
Hmm.
Um, and we were discussing what our projects would be and how we were filling our time. And one of my friends on that phone call said, "Well, Peter, you've been talking to us about this memoir you're going to be working on, forever. Why don't you stop talking about it, you jerk, and get to work on it?" And it was like,
Mm.
gauntlet thrown, dude. It's like, what could I say? No, I'm too busy, making lunch for me and my wife. It's like, okay, it's put up or shut up time. I am in fact going to start working on that. And this was, maybe 3 months into COVID. And at that point, none of us knew when it was going to end. It was like, we thought we might have been looking at the end of civilization as we knew it at that point.
Hmm.
Um, so, the next morning I walked out to my computer, and another thing I guess you should know about me is that I'm a lifelong journal keeper. On October 12th, 1978, I made a journal entry. I was living in Paris at the time. Um, I wrote stuff down on October 12th, 1978, and then I did it on the 13th, and then the 14th too, and then the 15th. And now here we are in 2025, and I've made a journal entry every night since then. It's been about
Wow.
6 million words worth of journal entries that I've done, um, which shows that there was something essential to me about that, about processing every day. about the importance of every day to me and about
Hmm.
what I was going through, what I was thinking about. So anyway, I had a plentiful source material for this memoir, and I selected, it was another on the comma moment for me, actually, was right after I graduated from college, an English major, boarded a one-way flight to France, and started studying at the Alliance Française in Paris. So that was the time period that I thought, well, the coming of age memoir is an important genre, and I thought I can contribute there. So anyway, 6 months go by. I write 100,000 words of this memoir, which is that's a lot of words. It was the longest book I'd
Hmm.
ever written. Um, but I had this idea. Once I had the manuscript done, I'm a big admirer of the novels of Charles Dickens, and one of the things I loved about Dickens novels when I was reading them, as a in as a kid, really, was that I loved the frontispieces, where it was like these illustrations that ran at the beginning of every chapter that showed what the ridiculous characters were up to, especially in Dickens's comic novels, what they were up to in the chapter ahead. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be funny if I did frontispieces for the three parts that this memoir I wrote were going to be?
Hmm.
I had been taking art classes for a while. It had always been an interest of mine. But what I found is when I was doing the artwork to put in the memoir was that my identity as an artist was serving the purpose of mocking and making fun of my identity as a writer. So there was this whole dialogue that was going on between my drawings and what I had written. And it was a comic memoir too. So it's not like serious versus laughable. It was more like uh, straight man and the comedian, working
Hmm.
together. Um, and really, it opened a door for me that I never expected to open because pretty soon after I completed the frontispiece drawings, I thought, well, that would be a good place to put another drawing. Pretty soon, I was peppering the whole manuscript with them. So, uh, it was like I couldn't even tell you what day it was or how it occurred to me that oh, it would be a good idea to put a drawing with that. But somehow the idea came and it opened up a whole new world for me that wouldn't have opened in any other way had that friend not told me, you jerk, get to work on your memoir and stop talking
Hmm.
about it. But that command wouldn't have been something I could have obeyed like back when I was, editing 10 issues of Men's Health every year or writing books for other people. It was like I needed the quiet, I needed the silence, I needed the scare, frankly, to propel me forward from where I was and very anxious about where all this was going to go, if anything, if my career was over before I was even done with it myself. Um, and my answer in writing and in drawings set me on a whole new path, which wouldn't have happened had I not been on the comma. I'm so grateful that it happened, and looking back on it now, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life.
It seems like it, and it's interesting. Obviously, I hear a lot of these stories, right? Having these conversations, doing this podcast, but um, it's fascinating because, first of all, just to see kind of how that inspiration eventually manifests in you, how these messages kind of come to you. And I guess what I'm curious about as a random question is like, now that you've discovered this at this point in your story, right? Now that you've discovered this, now that you're starting to see kind of a new path forward and clearly have stumbled on something that you are enjoying and is inspiring you, if you look back through history, look back through the thread, can you see where this thread may have always been there? I mean, I don't know. I'm asking you.
Yeah, it was pretty funny because I've been into artwork for a long time, and when I was in high school, even people were telling me, you're really good at this. What are your plans for it? And somehow I got off to college. I was an English major, working very hard at that, um, and I was just more focused on reading and writing at that point in my life than I ever was on the artwork. But fast forward another 3 decades. I've had this successful career in magazines. Um, but I felt like all day long I was talking, writing, and editing, and I needed something to give me a break, to get outside of that process. So my wife had taken an adult education art class in the little town where we lived in Pennsylvania. And I thought, oh, I'd like to try that class. And, what the curriculum was taking us through, a series of different kinds of artwork, pencil sketches, acrylics, narrative stuff, watercolors. It was like all this stuff that, just to try your hand at it. And I thought, oh, well, that feels really good to do this. And it's a great break from, my big deal career and job. So I kept on taking art classes. I took a figure drawing class. I took another acrylics class. And as I was going along here, I was realizing, okay, I do have some skills. I'm developing skills in artwork. Now, where am I going to go with that? I didn't have the answer to that, but I was taking an acrylics class when we got out here to Colorado, and I'd done a landscape of a road that was very cool in California with a series of mountains in the back. And I finished the acrylic. It was a perfectly fine painting, but it just looked boring to me. So I mentioned that there was a road in this drawing in this painting. I thought, well, wouldn't it be funny if I put a bunch of rabbits commuting in one direction on the road and a bunch of foxes commuting in the opposite direction on the road? And there was one fox in the middle of it who was like looking over at the rabbit and thinking, maybe I should eat one of those rabbits rather than just running past it. Anyway, I finished this piece of artwork, got a round of applause in my art class. Like literally, I showed it and everyone applauded. And I thought, aha, so there's another purpose I can put my artwork to rather than just recording the world as I see it, but rather commenting on the world as I see it. And,
Hmm.
I realized now, getting a chill even thinking about it, that that was my step in the direction of putting a narrative quality to the artwork that I do. And it opened up a whole career moment for me because I work as a cartoonist now. Um, that that like melding of the reality that I depict through my artwork, but also making a commentary on the nature of life and living while I'm doing that is is a whole new way to communicate that I blundered along. It took me a couple of decades to find it, but once I drew those foxes and rabbits on the acrylic painting, I had a new direction in life. So that it turned
Hmm.
out that roadway in the landscape was the one that I eventually got onto. And I was
Hmm.
running with the foxes and rabbits. What would be funny? What's funny about my interpretation of life? And I've had enough success at it now that I know, yeah, I can
Yeah.
do that. I'm funny. I have a unique take on the world, and people enjoy it. So hooray for that.
Well, and tell me if I'm crazy, but kind of as I, as an outsider, looks at your story as you're painting it for us, it seems like, the skill set and the aptitude was always there because even in the work that you were doing, quote unquote, the corporate work you were doing, those are still creative media, right? Magazines and so forth. And it seems like perhaps maybe I'm making this shit up, right? But perhaps whether you were aware of it or not, you were always commenting on life because in doing it through other people's work, right? You as a magazine editor, you're shaping the commentary, that's being communicated or conveyed by these publications.
Yeah.
But yet here you are, you're getting to comment through the ink of your own pen or, the lead of your own pencil, so to speak, versus having to do it through other people's media.
Well, when I was working at Playboy, Playboy had a substantial amount of humor in there. I did a bunch of humor for Playboy, not as an artist, but on the editorial side. And then, Men's Health magazine, for those of you who aren't aware of it, at least when I worked there, it was known as a very funny magazine that was super helpful to men. So
Hmm.
it was an alchemy of humor and service journalism that was extremely popular for a certain stretch of time there in the in the 90s and the aughts. and
Hmm.
it was, the biggest men's magazine in the world. And, so I was flexing those muscles. I was communicating through the magazine, and having a ball doing it because, it was a great job. I worked with great people. We had the attention of the publishing industry. So, there was a part of me that was communicating that way, but it wasn't until the comma came and artwork really became like seriously part of what I do that I realized, oh, this is the voice that's original to me and authentic to me and a great opportunity for me. So I dived right in on it. But
Hmm.
like I've been saying, had I not been kicked out of doing everything that I knew how to do and had to reassess it all, I might never have discovered it, even though it was latent within me, as you've said. This whole time, it took a period of quiet
Hmm.
for me to identify it and emerge with it as my thing.
You didn't say these words, but as you're saying them, I realize it's like that's what so many people have communicated to me, through their stories on this podcast is the comma made me do it. You know, I'm like, and it's so straightforward and simple, but it's so true. All these stories in yours too. It's like it was the comma, and I think that's one of the reasons why I like having these conversations. Is there's so many different ways you can interpret the comma in your own experience and in other people's experiences, and sometimes it's a pause and rest point. Sometimes it's a scary place to not know where you're going. Sometimes it's oh, I need to kind of get myself sprung and coiled because I know where I'm going next, and so many other ways to interpret it. But yet, either no matter what, there's always like you can look back on the comma and extract meaning from it and value from it, which takes me to the third question in our five questions, Peter. So, as you look back at this comma that you sat on, what did you learn about yourself as a result?
Well, while you were discussing the comma, the phrase occurred to me, it's a comma, it's not a cliff. So,
Mm,
so it's a pause, it's not the end of the road. Um, so, looking back on it, what and I've adopted this as part of my creative process too. Sometimes you just need to stop and let the next good idea come to you. And unless you make time for that, unless you respect that pause as being an opportunity rather than a death knell, um, then you're not going to get what you need out of the comma if you don't embrace the comma, if you don't embrace
hmm.
the pause, if you don't try a few things in the opportunity that's afforded you by the fact that all of your other hubbub in your life has died down suddenly. And I was all about the hubbub. I love the demands that the magazine industry put on me because I was always working toward a deadline. That magazine would ship off to the printer and I was on to the next thing. It was like I was avoiding the panic of asking myself, is any of this like actually important to you as a human being? Also, I was in
Mm,
a different time in my life then. My wife and I were raising our two sons. They were going off to college. That's legendarily expensive to do. So I don't have any regrets about the long time I spent in the magazine industry. It was great for me. I put together skills that are vital to me every day. But I could have very easily, had the world not changed, had the publishing industry not, as we know it, not ended, I could have kept on going straight on through until I slumped over of a heart attack at my desk
mm,
without experiencing any of the rest of this stuff. And,
mm,
it was appropriate for the time of life I was in as a father and as the guy who was supporting my family. I was proud of that. I was so glad I was in a position to do it. And, my wife and sons were grateful to me. And that life phase came to an end.
mm,
And it came conveniently for me, thank goodness, because, we paid the last tuition bill probably 8 months before I was laid off finally.
mm.
So, like, whew, thank goodness that happened. But
Right.
it was also very important to me personally, as opposed to the career guy, it was important to me personally to take stock when the comma came and and be accepting of the lessons it was going to teach me. So
Mhm.
I'm grateful to it, and I now know that it was a comma, not a cliff. At the time, I didn't know that it wasn't a cliff, but I can tell you now, I kept going.
Hmm. I mean, there's so much in what you shared that I'm kind of taking from it. It's like it's easy for us to get critical of, where we were based on where we are now. Oh, well, I don't do that anymore. I look back at some of my own examples, and it's like everything I did in every decade, I was for the most part pretty happy doing, and it served me at the time. And even though where I've landed now in this decade is very different than those places, and I don't want to go backwards to those places, it doesn't mean that they didn't serve me when I was there, right? And vice versa. Even just because I was there, in that decade didn't mean that I was somehow missing out on the opportunity to be here either. So
Mhm.
I kind of hear
Yeah,
that from.
it's a small, like, I think of the rise of the artwork in my career. It was a small voice in the beginning, and it was appropriate that it was a small voice because I had other things to do. But how nice that I heard that small voice and that it became, something that would grow in my career. Um, and if I hadn't done that, I don't know what I'd be doing now. Working at a shoe
Hmm.
store. Not that there's anything wrong with working at a shoe store, but you know, I had to listen to the small voice while there were other demands on me. And that's another thing I would encourage people who are watching this to do is, take a look around at what those temptations and um, small indicators are in your life, and
Hmm.
they be showing a way to something much bigger and more important if you give them the time that they require to develop.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what we're all about in and living interesting and fulfilling lives.
Hmm. Peter, this is a good setup for the fourth question, and you probably already answered this a fair amount, but feel free to add whatever else you'd like to, and that is what has changed for you as a result of sitting on this comma.
Yeah, it has all been a question of self-motivation and doing things that are rewarding to me personally rather than rewarding to Men's Health magazine or Playboy magazine or that wannabe writer whose book I've written for them. Those are all key for those institutions and those people, and I'm glad I was in a position to take care of them. But it's doesn't even compare. There's no comparison between the reward I felt in those jobs to the personal satisfaction I take when I publish something on Substack and overnight I've got 6,000 people responding to me about it. It's like
Hmm.
people are looking at what I do and communicating with me directly about what's going on in their own lives, how what I wrote about reflects on them and their experience, or that it just made them laugh, or they gave them a break during their day when they were having a difficult time and they hopped on my Substack and got a few laughs out of it and reset their day because of it. All of that I now realize was there within me. I was diverting it into, very specific jobs. But now the motivation of having my own audience, having my own voice, communicating directly, it means that, it's not like I like struggle to get out to my office in the morning. It's like, oh my goodness, what do I get to do today? And oh, there's
Hmm.
that great idea. I really need to nail that one. It's like all these things are bubbling up within me and I'm acting on them directly all the time.
Mm.
That is such a privilege. And I'm so grateful that I found my way here.
I love that. Let's go into the fifth question as we start to kind of wrap things up then. So, Peter, what does getting off the comma look like for you?
Uh, it has to do with taking a look at the big silence out ahead and saying, well, what kind of music do I want to fill that with? What kind of activity do I want to fill that with? What's going to be entertaining and amusing for me to work on? Um, and I knew I was getting off the comma. There was early on. I guess people are aware of what Substack is. It's a blogging
Hmm.
platform. I went on there in 2022, and my wife and I were traveling in France for a while, and I found myself on the following the footsteps of Vincent van Gogh for a while. I'm not alone in loving his artwork, but I got it in my head that what I was going to do while I was in France was solve the mystery of how Vincent van Gogh died, because a lot of people don't believe the suicide thing, and I
Mm,
personally don't believe it either. Anyway, I came up with a Substack that kind of advanced a theory of who actually killed Vincent van Gogh. So I put it up on my Substack. It was, an illustrated argument for what was going on in Van Gogh's life and who offed him. Um, I put that up on my Substack, and probably within 3 weeks, 60,000 people had seen it.
mm,
And it was like that was by far the biggest reaction I'd ever gotten to any of my posts. And at that moment, I realized that I actually had something here that um, that I could devote the rest of my life to, and that
hmm.
would be entertaining for me and for the people who read it. Um, so being off the comma is a matter of, you know, this sentence continues. I don't know where it's going either, but it's very exciting to watch the steps that I've made along the way. Um, so, you know, I'm not going to finish writing that sentence for the rest of my life. I hope that'll be a long time because I have a lot of work I want to do. Um, but it's a beautiful thing to look back at that comma and see all the work that it spurred me to do and all the self-discovery that it launched for me. So thank you,
Mm.
comma. I couldn't have done it without you.
I love that. I love that right there. Yeah, being able to, what's the phrase I said the other day? It's like everything we experience has the potential to serve meaning or to deliver meaning or something like that. So yeah, I'm definitely hearing you.
Yeah, if you
Um,
hang in there with it, if you're not afraid of it, if you're okay at looking into the void and thinking, how do I fill it? Um, these are all skills we need to develop if we want to be our true selves.
mm,
So you go, watchers of this, be your true selves.
yeah.
But make sure you can still pay the rent too.
Right. That's the hard part in our society, right? Is we're also trained to be, short-term oriented and instant gratification and so forth. And that's the journey I'm going through right now as well, is like how to think longer term, how to get comfortable with discomfort and how to kind of zoom out and recognize where things fit in kind of the grander scheme. So I love
I
your
don't want to
story for that reason.
diminish anybody's economic requirements of their lives. I lived with that for a long time. I'm happy to be beyond it now. And there are ways, if you're looking, that you can subsidize what you want to do with what you are doing.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of energy to do that.
Yeah.
And but it's also the possibility that you will discover who you were meant to be. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a discovery we all have to seek out.
Nice. Peter, closing things as we start to wrap up. So, I'll put this in the show notes, obviously, all of the links. Where can people find you? Folks who want to read the Substacks and see the things that you've written or just follow you on social media and kind of holler at you. Walk us
Uh,
through where folks can locate you.
Yeah, so the Substack is petermoore.substack.com. So that's not so hard. And most of my stuff ends up there. I've recently launched, um, based on my Substack, I was hired as a cartoonist and columnist for the Colorado Sun, which is, a very big online newspaper here in Colorado. And my pitch to them was, Coloradans are all about how great their state is and how great they are. Wouldn't it be perfect if I did a cartoon that made fun of everything that Coloradans love? And
Mm.
the editor went for it immediately. So I've had a lot of fun insulting my fellow Coloradans for the last 3 years. And but then once Colorado NPR noticed that I was doing that for the Colorado Sun, they had me on to do commentaries and animations for them. So those are my two sort of like legit gestures toward being part of the publication world, NPR and the Colorado Sun. But all that stuff eventually migrates to Substack, and I've got about 15,000 followers on Substack now, which it's not 2 million, but it's also a pretty good number.
Hmm.
Sometimes depending on how funny I was that week, I scale the heights of who the funniest writers are on Substack, and the highest I've ever reached was number three, which meant that for that week at least I was funnier than Garrison Keillor and Dave Barry. So
Okay.
then I plunged after that, but for a minute I was a very funny guy, which felt great.
Nice, nice. Well, and like you said, it's a long term, so that could be again, right? So, as we wrap up, one of the things I do with every episode is a section called acknowledgments, because obviously the whole point in being here is to share people's stories, which is a way of lifting up voices and normalizing, people being heard. So, this is your opportunity to give a voice to, boost, to lift up, or promote people and causes and organizations that matter to you. So I call it acknowledgments. And that can be organizations, causes, other creators, or just people in your immediate circle that you want to acknowledge. Who would you like to acknowledge today?
Just over the course of this conversation, I realized that who I need to acknowledge was me on the comma and all the people out there who are listening and watching this who are on the comma themselves. I don't mean it to make it sound like, oh, it was a simple thing for me to lose my job and then commence my career as a writer and cartoonist. It was a very difficult thing. So what I want to do is acknowledge the difficulty that maybe many of the people who are listening to this interview are going through. But that difficulty means that you're giving serious thought to it, that you're earning the next step along the way after the comma. So I would just acknowledge everybody who's having a struggle, who's trying to figure it out, who are staring into the void and are terrified of it. I too was there. I acknowledge my scaredy cat self back then, but I also want to point out that, unless you go through that darkness, you're not going to get into the light. So I acknowledge that struggle, and I also acknowledge what it can produce for you, which can
Hmm.
be a really beautiful thing if you stick with it. So,
Nice.
let's look into the dark and the void together, and hope we see glimmers of sunrise on the horizon.
Nice. Nice. Anyone else you wanted to acknowledge before we wrap?
I want to acknowledge Roz Chast, who's a brilliant cartoonist for the New Yorker. People often tell me that they see my work or her work in mine, which I disagree with because she's a genius and I'm not. Um, but if you're looking for a wedding or an anniversary gift for anybody, just you can Google her book. You Can Only Yell at Me for One Thing at a Time. And it's
Hmm.
all about the amazing, difficult dynamics that couples go through. And, my wife and I got a copy of the book when it came out, and we were just like nodding and laughing at the same time because Roz Chess is so good um, at poking fun at that kind of domestic drama. And anybody
Hmm.
who works with someone has plenty of domestic drama. So you can only yell at me about one thing at a time. That's by Roz Chast, and it's an amazing piece of work.
Nice. Nice. We'll be sure to put this information in the show notes so people can click on the links and check these things out and these folks out. Peter, thank you again. I know there's so much more that you could share with us as a storyteller and as a creator, but all podcasts have to come to an end. So I will look forward to following your work and definitely want to wish you a wonderful rest of the week ahead. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Paul, and bye, listeners.
What an honor it is for me to hear and share these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way. Think about what you learned from this conversation. I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling or reflection because surprises can reveal themselves to you when you write your thoughts down. If you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Be sure to like this episode and follow the podcast here on this platform and all social media at Off the Comma. Feel free to interact and comment. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.